Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we turn complex history into essential insight. Today, we are strapping in for, well, one of the most volatile, identity-shaping periods in Japanese history, the Nanboku-cho, or Northern and Southern Courts period.
That's right.
This wasn't just, a 60-year civil war. It was an existential crisis that fundamentally redefined military governance and, astonishingly, still determines who we consider to be a legitimate emperor of Japan today.
We're talking about the years 1336 to 1392, a really turbulent time when the powerful Muromachi or Ashikaga shogunate was being forged. But this creation story is bloody. It's born entirely from this crisis of political and symbolic legitimacy following the abrupt collapse of the preceding Kamakura regime.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately, what we call the Tale of Two Thrones. This conflict is unique because the fight wasn't just over land or, military dominance. It was really a battle over the soul of the Japanese state. We had two rival imperial courts, each claiming the right to rule.
Yeah, on one side, you had the Northern Court, established in Kyoto. Now, these were essentially puppet rulers, basically employees installed directly by the military government, the emerging Ashikaga shogunate. Their legitimacy rested entirely on military might and, well, political reality. They were in the capital, they were running the day-to-day government.
But then hiding out in the remote mountains of Yoshino, you had the Southern Court, led by the very determined Emperor Go-Daigo. And this is where the symbolic power really comes into play, isn't it?
Absolutely. Despite their territorial disadvantage and, constantly having to move, the Southern Court maintained physical control of these sacred Japanese imperial treasures, the regalia.
The mirror, the sword, and the jewel.
Exactly. And in Japanese tradition, possessing those regalia is the ultimate confirmation of symbolic legitimacy. It doesn't matter how many soldiers you command, the Southern Court had the artifacts, even if the Northern Court had the armies in the capital city.
What's fascinating here, and kind of mind-bending, is that this struggle over symbolic versus real power didn't just end in 1392 when the war officially concluded.
No, not at all.
For centuries afterwards, historians generally defaulted to acknowledging the Northern Court as legitimate simply because, well, they won, and they provided the continuous imperial line.
Yes, but here's where it gets really interesting and why this 14th century conflict still actually matters to you today. In 1911, Emperor Meiji, who was himself a direct descendant of that victorious northern line, issued an official imperial edict.
Okay.
He declared that the emperors of the defeated Southern Court were the true and legitimate claimants during that period.
Wait. 5 centuries after the fact, the reigning emperor declared the losing side had been right all along. Why? Why would they go back and change the official history like that?
Well, because it profoundly influenced the modern concept of the Tenseikai, the emperor system. This was at a time when the Meiji government was actively trying to create a narrative of imperial infallibility and direct, unbroken ancient rule. By declaring the Southern Court legitimate, they essentially validated the symbolic importance of the imperial regalia over brute force. They were arguing that true legitimacy rests with spiritual inheritance, not military conquest.
So it was a 20th century political move, basically rewriting history to cement the sacred nature of the throne, validating the righteousness of those Southern loyalists.
Precisely. It just demonstrates the enduring power of symbolism over mere military victory, even centuries later.
That sets the stage perfectly. So how did Japan even fall into this bizarre situation? 2 emperors, we have to rewind just slightly, to the chaotic years right before the Nanboku-cho began, the colossal failure of the Kenmu Restoration between 1333 and 1336.
Right. The background music for this whole period is the widespread discontent that brought down the previous Kamakura shogunate. By the 1330s, the warrior class, the samurai, were absolutely furious. The ruling Shush clan had become excessively centralized. They'd systematically frozen out other powerful warrior families from, decision-making. They were packing the council of state with their own appointees. It felt less like a warrior democracy and more like a Shush family business.
And the final insult, ironically, came from the wars they won, specifically the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281.
It's exactly right. If you're a samurai, you fight to get paid, essentially. And historically, victory meant new land grants you conquer territory, you get rewarded with it. But when the Japanese successfully repelled the Mongols, they were defending existing territory. They didn't actually conquer any new land.
So despite huge personal sacrifice, massive military debt taken on by the warrior class, there was just nothing new to distribute as a reward.
Nothing. 0 new lands.
Right.
So you've got a ruling family hoarding power and a loyal warrior class that's unpaid and heavily indebted.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So when Emperor Go-Daigo started planning his anti-Huja coalition, the ground was already pretty fertile for revolt.
Go-Daigo saw this as his golden opportunity, and his ambition was, well, monumental. He wanted to restore genuine imperial power and fully end centuries of warrior domination. He was explicitly modeling his rule on Emperor Daigo from way back in the 10th century, a time of effective imperial governance. This wasn't just a minor tweak. This was meant to be a full-scale return to dynastic rule, a goal that actually remained elusive until the Meiji Restoration hundreds of years later.
And he had some serious intellectual firepower backing him up, didn't he? We mentioned Prince Morinaga, his son, who argued for making the court more militarily capable. But the key figure here is Kitabatake Chikafusa.
Chikafusa, yes. He was a Kyoto noble, a general, and a really profound scholar. He authored the Jin Shtuki,
Which translates roughly as the records of the legitimate succession of the divine emperors.
something like that, yeah. This text detailed exactly why the imperial line in Japan was sacred and why true authority must reside with the emperor. And the Jino Shtuki, well, it became the ideological bedrock for royalists for centuries. It provided the very justification for the 19th century restorationists who eventually overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate.
So Go-Daigo had the divine right argument, the historical precedent, the intellectual backing, but the restoration completely failed. Just 3 years. Older history used to say it was because he was bad at rewarding his troops.
Yeah, that was the old take. But modern findings are much more nuanced. Land reward registers actually show that Go-Daigo was quite effective at rewarding the samurai who backed him. The failure wasn't really economic, it was cultural and administrative. Go-Daigo wanted to restore not just political power, but also high-end period court culture.
So he was winning militarily but losing politically because he insisted on reviving what sounds to us like obsolete court poetry contests and extremely detailed, long-forgotten ceremonies. Was he just completely out of touch with the warrior class he needed?
Precisely. He even wrote a treatise, the Kenmo Nenshu Guji, detailing which court ceremony should be performed on which specific day of the year. Now, the samurai, hardened by the Mongol wars and the fall of the Huju, they wanted a new, strong, streamlined military regime. They looked at Go-Daigo trying to revive elaborate robes and ancient music and, well, they saw a man living in the past.
That alienation must have created the crucial opening for the man who would become the founder of the next shogunate, Ashikaga Tokoji.
Yes. Tokaji was initially one of Go-Daigo's key generals.
So how did he go from loyal servant to the ultimate betrayer?
His opportunity came in 1335. He was ordered to defeat the Nakasendai rebellion. This is a final attempt to restore the old Kamakura regime. Tokaji crushed the rebellion, but instead of returning power to Go-Daigo, he seized Kamakura for himself. The moment of official betrayal was crystal clear. He claimed the title of Seiti Shugen, the barbarian subduing generalissimo, and started granting lands to his own followers without any imperial permission.
That's a clear declaration of independence from the emperor right there.
Absolutely. Go-Daigo tried to stop him, but Tokaji's military machine was already rolling. He was forced out of Kyoto briefly in early 1336 by imperial loyalists, but that only solidified his resolve and led to his consolidation of power in the West.
Right. He retreated to Kyushu.
He fled to Kyushu, secured critical alliances, and achieved a really decisive military victory at the Battle of Tatarahama later that year. He defeated the loyalist Kikuchi clan at Hakata Bay. This win made him, in the words of one source, virtually master of Kyushu. So armed with control of western Japan, he returned and cemented his power at the Battle of Minatogawa in 1336.
And that's where he killed the key imperial loyalist general Kusunoki Masashige and seized Kyoto for good.
Exactly, and that was the final fatal split. Tokaji enthroned a new emperor, Kumyu, from the rival Jimmu-Shinto line, starting the northern court in Kyoto, and he immediately codified his rule with the Kenmu Law Code.
But Go-Daigo, showing incredible resilience, maybe some guile too, he slipped away to the mountains of Yoshino.
And crucially, the regalia he handed over to the Ashikaga. They were fakes. He took the true imperial regalia with him, setting up the southern court. This transformed the ideological dispute into a full-scale, decades-long civil war between two competing lines of sovereignty.
Okay, so the new Ashikaga regime started with a bang, defeating Go-Daigo militarily. But that momentum didn't guarantee immediate stability, did it?
Not at all. In fact, within just 15 years, the shogunate nearly collapsed under its own weight during what's known as the Kanu disturbance in the 1350s.
This conflict seems like a perfect illustration that winning the war doesn't mean you know how to run the government.
That's a great way to put it. Ashikaga Takauji, the military genius, proved to be, well, a largely ineffective ruler day to day. So for the first decade or so of the shogunate, governance largely fell to his brother, Ashikaga Tadayoshi.
And the conflict that blew up between them wasn't just typical brotherly disagreement, was it? It sounds like a fundamental clash over how the government should even operate.
It was. Exacerbated by personal enmity, sure, but rooted in an institutional split. You can clearly delineate this bureaucratic separation. Think of it like a split in modern corporate governance, maybe.
Okay.
Takauji controlled the military and the carrot functions, the board of retainers for military discipline, and the office of rewards for distributing lands to loyal vassals. He was essentially operations and HR for the warrior class.
Right. And Tadayoshi.
Tadayoshi, meanwhile, controlled the stick and the rule of law. He ran the Board of Inquiry and the Board of Coadjutors. These were the key judicial organs handling complex land disputes, inheritance quarrels, general jurisprudence. He was the Supreme Court and the Justice Department, if you will.
Okay, so when two brothers control separate, vital parts of the bureaucracy, friction seems inevitable.
Especially when you add their philosophical differences. Takauji the Revolutionary favored pragmatic innovation. He was willing to appoint his most effective vassals as shugo governors and divide up Shuna state lands to reward them. Whatever worked.
While Tadayoshi was the conservative.
Exactly. Tadayoshi wanted order and stability. He staunchly opposed the division of landed estates and really aimed to preserve past policies wherever possible. He was looking backwards, Takauji forwards.
So you have the revolutionary military leader versus the conservative administrator, each controlling half the legal system, a pressure cooker, which finally exploded after Tadayoshi failed to assassinate Takauji's key deputy, Kano Morono.
That was the trigger. Following the failed plot, Tadayoshi was forced to retire, become a monk. But this was just a prelude. In 1350, he openly rebelled, and in a truly shocking move, he defected and joined the Southern Court.
Wow. The regime's conservative figurehead, the upholder of law, suddenly joining the opposition, the ones holding the symbolic imperial legitimacy. That must have been utterly destabilizing.
It was nearly fatal for the Ashikaga. Tadayoshi, now appointed general by the Southern Court, actually defeated his brother Takauji in 1351. He temporarily occupied Kyoto and executed his rivals, the powerful Kusa brothers. Now, Takauji eventually regained control, defeated him, and Tadayoshi died suddenly in 1352. The Taiheki, the war chronicle, suggests poisoning. But the damage was done. Tadayoshi's defection unleashed a massive resurgence for the Southern Court. The regime was so fractured you had their own top generals flipping sides.
Right, these turncoats.
Exactly. The ensuing chaos saw a huge wave of these defectors, Jushin, deserting the Muromachi regime, the imperialist offensives that temporarily seized Kamakura in 1352, and Kyoto in 1353 and 1354. They were led by Tadayoshi's adopted son, Ashikaga Tadafuyu, and supported by defecting regional shugo lords like Yamada Tokiuchi.
So the regime's own established leaders were openly turning on the shogun. It shows just how close the nascent Ashikaga government came to total collapse in the 1350s.
Absolutely. The Nanboku-cho War wasn't just northern versus southern. For a while there, it was really Ashikaga versus Ashikaga.
The instability of that Kanyu disturbance must have shown the shogunate they desperately needed loyal provincial allies who could enforce order on the ground.
It really did.
And this crisis seems to have been the driving force behind maybe the most profound economic and political change of the whole period. The rise of the Shugo lords and the land revolution?
That's exactly right. The Shugo were the provincial governors appointed by the shogun. Now, in the Muromachi period, they evolved into something far, far more powerful than their Kamakura predecessors. They were often recruited from Ashikaga branch families, names like Hosokawa, Yamana, Shiba, and they were rewarded with these province-wide appointments.
And compared to the Kamakura era, where the Shugo were mainly, police chiefs and military coordinators?
Pretty much. The Muromachi Shugo held vastly expanded authority. They could adjudicate land disputes, enforce local law, levy taxes, and issue the critical Hanzai decrees.
Those were the half-tax decrees that carved up estates.
Exactly. They allowed the Shugo to grant half the income, or sometimes half the land itself of an estate, to warriors as reward. And as the men on the ground, they became extremely wealthy middlemen. They were responsible for collecting various local taxes, notably the tansen, a kind of property tax, from all local landholders, including nobles and temples. And they consistently inflated these assessments, skimming the difference and financing their own growing provincial armies.
And their rise fundamentally liquidated the traditional land tenure system, the shun system. This system had been the backbone of Japan's economy for hundreds of years.
It divided ownership between a local samurai steward, the G2, and a noble proprietor, usually living far away in Kyoto. The war just allowed the local stewards to seize control. They converted noble land illegally into their own private holdings called shigyo.
And the Shugo lords then legitimized this massive land grab.
They did. By enfeoffing these local samurai, bringing both the land and the samurai under their own banner, this just accelerated the complete and utter collapse of the old land structure.
This must have created a totally new local political reality.
It did. Since every landed interest from local temples to individual samurai was facing security threats from this land chaos, the smaller, independent local samurai, known as kokujin, found themselves drawn into direct vassalage with the powerful shugo. They basically exchanged their independence for security and protection under the big guy.
And the defining contract that really sealed the noble class's fate was the Shugo Yuke, the Shugo contract.
Yes. Imagine you are a noble living comfortably, maybe a bit nervously, in Kyoto. Your estate manager out in the province keeps telling you that harvest payments are delayed because of the war, or bandits, or whatever excuse.
So to simplify their lives and just guarantee some income, the noble proprietor transferred all the estate management responsibility, collecting rent, managing disputes entirely to the powerful Shubo in exchange for a guaranteed fixed year-end income, the Nengu, supposedly delivered to Kyoto.
In theory, it sounds practical, right? Less hassle. But in reality, it was the death blow for the nobility's power. The Shugo used the contract to appoint his own vassal samurai as managers on the ground, stripping the noble of all direct authority and physical ties to the land.
So the noble becomes just an absentee landlord?
Exactly, relying on increasingly meager payments that the Shugo heavily skimmed or simply stopped delivering altogether, claiming expenses. Their ancient, land-based wealth just evaporated.
And beyond the noble estates, the Shugo also systematically took control over public lands, the Kokugaryo.
Yeah. These lands were traditionally run by civil governors, the kokushi, appointed by the court. As the civil administration just fractured during the war, the military Shugo simply took over the functions of the kokushi. This meant the farmer was no longer seeing civil law backed by the court when paying his taxes, he was seeing military force. By usurping these functions, the Shugo gained oversight of pretty much all land, private and public, in their province, further establishing their vassalage ties with every local samurai type.
And to cement this change, the Shogun formalized this power shift in 1346.
Yes, by granting Shugo the right to judge localized criminal matters like crop stealing and even make temporary land assignments. These were previously strict Kamakura regime jurisdictions. By granting this authority, the Muromachi regime basically confirmed the Shugo as the true provincial masters.
It's critical, though, as you mentioned, that while the Shugo were dominant, they weren't yet the fully independent territorial daimyo of the later Sengoku period, right?
That's a key distinction. Their power was built not on outright personal ownership of the whole province, but on these complicated intertwined vassalage ties they forged with local samurai. They were using the framework of the old system, in a way, as camouflage for their new military dominance. The system of dual rights was technically still recognized on paper, even though the noble side was essentially defunct in practice.
Okay, so with the Shugo firmly established as these major provincial powers, the next big challenge for the shogunate was integration and control. How do you manage these powerful new players?
Right. This happened largely in the 1360s and 1370s, under the second shogun, Ashikaga Yoshikira. This ushers in an era of consolidation and legitimation.
Yoshikira had a tough job then. Mend the fractured regime after the Kana disturbance and somehow integrate these powerful Shugo who had just seized massive amounts of land and power.
His key innovation in 1362 was the establishment of the Kanrei system, the deputy shogun council system.
Now, this sounds purely administrative, but it was actually a stroke of political genius, wasn't it? The goal was to give the most powerful military leaders a defined voice, a real stake in the central bureaucracy.
Precisely, to institutionalize conflict resolution, basically. The Kanrei became the spokesperson and the operational head of the government. And crucially, it was chosen hereditarily, rotating among three major related Shugo families, the Hosokawa, the Harakiyama, and the Shiba.
So by rotating this top office among these three powerful families, they were integrated, their egos were managed, they became partners, not just rivals, of the shogun.
Exactly. It created a kind of built-in check and balance among the most powerful lords and tied them directly to the success of the central regime. It provided institutional stability.
But stability needs more than just institutions. The shoguns still needed coercive power, real teeth to ensure obedience, even against these big shugos. How did Yoshikira demonstrate that?
He gained shogunal hegemony by skillfully practicing divide and conquer, pitting the shugo against one another when necessary. The perfect example is the Shiba family in 1366. They held the Kanrei post at the time, but they grew too powerful, maybe too complacent, a direct threat to Yoshikira's authority.
So what was the response? You can't just fire your deputy shogun easily.
No, but Yoshikira simply declared Shiba Takatsune a traitor. He then ordered other key shugo lords, the Yamana, the Sasaki, the Toki, to attack and defeat him. This was a crucial demonstration. The shogun had the punitive capability to rally a coalition of governors to destroy one of their own and then redistribute his territory to those who were loyal. It signaled clearly that no single shugo could operate outside of central command.
Wow. Okay, so military force and political maneuvering handled the warriors. But beyond that, the regime needed cultural legitimacy, right? Especially to attract the nobles back into the fold in Kyoto.
Yes, and this push really came under the next Kanrei, Hosokawa Yoriyuki, who governed during the minority of the young third shogun, Yoshimitsu. Yoriyuki understood that military strength wasn't enough. They needed what one historian calls the charisma of culture, something the previous Kamakura shogunate had kind of lacked. They were seen as rough warriors.
So how did he build that charisma?
He actively worked to legitimize the regime in the eyes of the court nobles. He achieved this by having the young shogun, Yoshimitsu, participate directly in the ancient court ranking system and its ceremonies.
So the shogun formally accepted titles from the emperor, even though the emperor was essentially their appointee.
Yes. That act symbolically tied the highest military authority directly to the primacy and ancient prestige of the imperial line.
And that had two major effects, I imagine.
It did. First, it provided the Ashikaga regime with the prestige and, well, the cultural polish it needed to govern Kyoto effectively, to be accepted by the court society. Second, it created a trend. The newly wealthy warrior class began to emulate courtly tastes. Things like poetry, tea ceremony, no drama, ink painting, garden design. This effectively disseminated court culture out into the warrior provinces, softening the hard edge of military rule over time.
And ideologically, Yoriyuki continued this sort of conservative bridge building. In 1368, he issued the last major Hansai decree, and you noted this one was fundamentally different from the earlier ones.
Yes, it was. Earlier Hansai decrees were essentially justifications for warriors taking land from nobles or temples. The 1368 decree was, on paper at least, the opposite. It was specifically aimed at protecting the lands of the most prestigious nobles, the imperial family itself, major temples like Todaiji and the Fujiwara regions, from further samurai division.
Now, was it effective on the ground? Did it actually stop the land grabbing?
Probably not very effective in practice. The land grabbing continued. But it was a powerful political statement. It ideologically tied the Ashikaga regime to the defense of traditional noble interests, cementing the political alliance with the court, even as the economic reality shifted dramatically.
So while the central government was consolidating power through courts and culture and political maneuvering, the actual military fight against the Southern Court was systematically being concluded out in the provinces.
Indeed. The final Southern Court offensive against Kyoto really faded out after 1362. The most stalwart imperial general in the central provinces, Kusunoki Masanori.
Son of the famous Masashige.
Yes, that lineage carried weight. He finally submitted in 1369, effectively ending the serious military threat in the heartland around Kyoto. But the really critical campaign was in the west.
That was the Kishu campaign, still a hotbed of resistance.
Exactly. Imagawa Sadayo, better known as Ryoshin, was appointed Kishu deputy in 1370. This wasn't a quick job. It was a massive multi-decade effort. Ryoshin systematically campaigned, finally defeating the persistent loyalist Kikuchi clan in 1381, and then turning on and defeating the powerful, sometimes independent-minded Shimazu family in 1385. By bringing Western Japan finally under firm Ashikaga rule, the Muromachi shogunate had secured military control over pretty much the entire country. This paved the way for the ultimate centralization under the now adult shogun, Yoshimitsu.
Right. So with the Shugo integrated, or at least managed, and regional resistance crushed, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu took full personal authority in 1379, and the shogunate entered its most powerful phase. This is the era of true centralization, control, and finally the end of the dual courts.
Yoshimitsu really was the unchallenged government of Japan for the next 50 years or so. He wasn't just a military leader, he was a brilliant, and some might say ruthless, political operator. He used bureaucracy, culture, and force to consolidate power, often at the expense of his own most powerful allies.
And his first major move was neutralizing the potential threat from those powerful provincial governors, the shugo, through a compulsory residence policy.
Yes, he essentially persuaded, or perhaps coerced, the most important central and western Shugo lords to build mansions and live semi-permanently in Kyoto. We know he personally visited Uchi Yoshihiro in 1389 to persuade him to take up residence there.
It sounds nice on the surface, a fancy mansion in the capital, but it was effectively luxurious house arrest, wasn't it?
It really was a gilded cage. Being in Kyoto restricted the Shugo lords' freedom of movement. Leaving the capital without shogunal permission was basically treason. They got drawn into the expensive cultural life of Kyoto, spending massive sums on luxury goods, no performances, tea ceremonies.
Keeping up with the Joneses, Ashikaga style.
Exactly. But they were cut off from their home provinces, from their local power base.
And that leads us to a crucial, maybe unintended consequence, doesn't it? If the Shugo Lord is busy attending poetry readings in Kyoto, who is actually running the province day to day,
The power vacuum was filled by the Shugo's hired local representatives, the deputy Shugo, known as the Shugodai, and the powerful local samurai, the Kukujin, who surrounded them. This meant that real, on-the-ground power gradually slipped away from the absentee Shugo and became decentralized again, but this time to these local managers. For the Shugo lords, the Kyoto residence policy was a status symbol that, in the long term, fatally eroded their provincial authority. It sowed the seeds of the later Sengoku period chaos.
to make sure he wasn't totally dependent on these increasingly fragmented and potentially disloyal provincial forces, Yoshimitsu also built his own personal muscle, the shogunal army, the Gobannanshu.
Yes, this was a significant development. A standing army of about 3,000 troops, organized into 5 divisions, directly dependent on him. Crucially, it included a loyal shogunal bodyguard, the Shinan, composed of Ashikaga relatives and powerful Koprujin local samurai who were vassals directly loyal to the shogun, bypassing the Shugo entirely.
So this independent force was a vital check on the provincial Shugo armies, a force loyal only to him.
Precisely. It gave him leverage, and with his own standing army and the Shugo lords effectively corralled in Kyoto, Yoshimitsu's policy became brutally simple. Systematically destroy any single Shugo family that became powerful enough to potentially challenge the center. No rivals allowed.
And we see this play out ruthlessly. First, in 1389, the Toki clan.
Right. The Toki controlled 3 key provinces, Mino, Ise, Owari. Too much power in one place. Yoshimitsu simply ordered the head, Toki Yasuyuki, to surrender one of them. When Yasuyuki refused, Yoshimitsu declared him a traitor, ordered a Toki relative to attack and defeat him, and then redistributed the confiscated land to reliable loyalists. Message sent.
Then came the massive confrontation, the Meitoku Rising in 1391, against the Yamana clan.
The Yamana were the single most powerful clan at that point. They controlled an incredible 11 provinces, almost a sixth of Japan. Unacceptable for Yoshimitsu. He used the pretext of the Yamana encroaching on imperial estates, leveraging that cultural legitimacy he'd built up, and recall the old, respected Kanrei Hosokawa Yoriyuki to rally a powerful coalition. This coalition included the Uchi clan, ironically enough.
So he used other powerful Shugo to crush the biggest threat.
Exactly. They utterly crushed the Yamana, reducing them from 11 provinces down to just 2 small ones, Jima and Hoki. It was a massive demonstration of shogunal hegemony.
And the final act in this display of power was in 1399 against Uchi Yoshihiro, the very man who had just helped him crush the Yamana. That seems like pure political duplicity.
It absolutely was. Yoshimitsu had used Yoshihiro to fight his other enemies, even secretly pitting the Uchi against another powerful Kyushu family, the Shoni. When Yoshihiro, understandably angered by this double dealing, refused a summons to Kyoto, probably fearing a trap, Yoshimitsu declared him an enemy. He gathered 5 major Shugo families, Hosokawa, Akamatsu, Kugoku, Shiba, Hatakeyama, and a massive army reported at 30,000 troops to besiege and defeat Uchi's much smaller force of 5,000 at the port city of Sakai, near Osaka. Uchi eventually committed suicide.
The message couldn't be clearer. No one, not even your most successful general, could challenge the combined centralized might of the shogun when he chose to exercise it.
Absolutely not. Yoshimitsu was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers.
How did the Muromachi regime fund all this?
Yeah.
The incredibly expensive centralization, the continuous warfare, the lavish Kyoto lifestyle. You mentioned they differed from Kamakura by incorporating commercial wealth.
Yes, this is a fundamental difference. The Kamakura regime relied almost entirely on agricultural wealth from landed estates. Yoshimitsu and the Muromachi government actively diversified their revenue streams. They began to systematically incorporate urban commercial wealth into the state budget. Notably, in 1393, they legalized the right to extract direct commercial taxes from moneylenders in Kyoto, specifically the wealthy brewers and pawnbrokers known as Sakaya Doso.
So taxes on commerce, on urban businesses, became a foundational revenue stream alongside the traditional agricultural taxes from shogunal estates, Goryosho, vassal land taxes, Kyosai, and contributions from the Shugo Shiseno.
Exactly. This reliable cash flow, independent of just land, was essential for maintaining the expensive Gobanshu, funding the massive Kyoto building projects like the Golden Pavilion, and frankly funding the lavish Kyoto lifestyle that kept the Shugo distracted and indebted.
Okay, so with overwhelming military, political, and financial control, Yoshimitsu finally tackled the original political crisis that had plagued Japan for over half a century, the dual courts.
Right. The endgame. In 1392, he managed to persuade the reigning Southern Court Emperor Go-Kamiyama to formally surrender the imperial regalia to the Northern Court Emperor Go-Komatsu, who was residing in Kyoto.
And the deal was?
The formal agreement, brokered by Yoshimitsu, was that the imperial succession would alternate between the northern and southern lines going forward, a compromise to end the war and reunify the imperial house. This brought the Nanboku-cho period, the era of northern and southern courts, officially to a close.
It ended the fighting, but not the political manipulation, as it turned out.
No. The northern line, now led by Emperor Go-Komatsu and firmly under Ashikaga control, simply reneged on that alternation agreement in 1412 when the time came for a potential southern successor. With Yoshimitsu's tacit approval, because the shogun had absolutely no interest in seeing the troublesome southern line revived, the succession was permanently secured through the northern branch.
So the Northern Court won the war, won the peace negotiations, and ultimately won the ideological battle, at least for the next 500 years, despite the lingering questions in that later Meiji revisionism we discussed. Okay, so let's try and bring all this together. Looking back, what did the Nanboku-cho period and the ensuing Ashikaga consolidation fundamentally establish in Japan? What's the big takeaway?
Well, the Ashikaga regime, as it was solidified under Yoshimitsu, was really built on three foundational policies that defined the next couple of centuries. First, strengthening direct vassalage ties between the shogun and the broader warrior class, forged in the crucible of civil war. Second, successfully integrating and leveraging the Shugo lords as powerful, if sometimes problematic, provincial governors, effectively mediating between the center and the periphery. And third, using policies like the half-tax, the Hanzei, to rhetorically at least bridge the divide between warrior rights and traditional noble rights, creating a basis for governing from Kyoto.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Muromachi system was kind of a subtle, maybe twisted evolution of the earlier Kamakura precedent, wasn't it?
In a way, yes. In the Kamakura period, the local samurai stewards, the Jito, had that clear intermediary role. They were loyal both to the shogun in Kamakura and legally obligated to pay rent to the noble proprietor back in Kyoto.
And that dual loyalty was stable because the Kamakura regime consciously protected both sets of rights, right? They upheld contracts.
Exactly. The Ashikaga invoked this same stabilizing precedent, particularly through the symbolism of the Hanzei decrees, like that conservative 1368 one, even while their actions were rapidly destroying the noble side of the economic equation. This attempt at synthesizing noble legitimacy and warrior governance was absolutely central to the Muromachi regime's ability to rule from Kyoto, at least for a while.
Ultimately, though, the Northern Court won. They provided the imperial line that continues to this day. Military victory, centralization, and ruthless political maneuvering prevailed over the symbolic power of the regalia held by the South. Yet, that struggle over legitimacy, over who is truly the rightful emperor, created a permanent historical wound, or at least a question mark.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The Southern Court's possession of the true regalia for much of the conflict, combined with the powerful legitimizing writings of Kitabatake Chikafu's Jinoshushiki, ensured that the Northern Line's victory always had a kind of asterisk next to it in some interpretations.
Which raises our final provocative thought for you, the listener. What does it tell you about the enduring nature of sovereignty, about legitimacy itself? that a military conflict from the 14th century required the modernizing Meiji government, 500 years later, to officially validate the legitimacy of the defeated side. It seems to demonstrate that the struggle for the true mandate in Japan was never fully resolved by the sword alone, but remained subject to the shifting political winds and the lasting, almost mystical power of historical symbolism.
It really reminds us that political victory can be temporary, sometimes messy. But ideological history, once written and believed, becomes its own kind of power, a battle that can span millennia.
That is a fascinating way to look at the enduring, complex impact of this incredibly turbulent era. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Japan's crisis of legitimacy.
Always a pleasure. We hope this gives you a great shortcut to understanding one of the most defining and often confusing periods of Japanese rule.